Hello and welcome to Property Question Time. My name's Stephen Galpin and this is the programme where you can have your property related questions answered by our team of experts. Now joining me today is property investor, mentor, CEO of Your Freedom Empire, Hayley Andrews. Hayley, hi.
Hi.
Nice to have you back again.
Good to be back.
And you're sitting next to your favourite property developer.
All-time favourite.
That's what she says that every time, depending who sits here.
Can I tell you, don't believe her.
No, I don't worry.
John Howard, thank you for coming in. Property developer, author, TV commentator and public speaker.
Thank you very much. Great to be here.
Good to have you back. Okay. Right, well, let's see if we can get on with the questions. And the first one goes to you, John. Do the panel think that both developers and the government are doing enough to make existing buildings safe post the Grenfell disaster? I ask because a survey has just shown that over 1,000 buildings in London alone are still unsafe.
Okay, well, it depends what you mean by unsafe, doesn't it? Because I think this needs to be broken down a little bit. First of all, you've got the Grenfell situation, which was absolute disaster, where the cladding was combustible and all the rest of it. That is disastrous, and I'm not sure how many of those there are in the UK, but I think the government have got to grips with those ones and are dealing with them accordingly. The second level down is where the cladding is non-combustible, which is good. It's how it should be, but they haven't got the fire breaks in them. Now, the fire breaks are something that came in not that many years ago. So what's happened is if you developed a block 10 years ago, you didn't have to put the fire breaks in because they've learnt since. Now you have to. So a lot of these blocks need the fire breaks put in at each level. Not too expensive to do, but of course it has to be scaffolded, and the scaffolding is a fortune. So on those ones, the government are not, as I understand, putting any grant towards it. The ones where they have got combustible cladding, they are doing so. So it's a huge problem, Stephen, massive problem. But if you break it down, like anything, it's like climbing a mountain. Don't look at the top, look at the first, 100 feet or something. There are two types of problems here. The very, very serious one, which is totally wrong and they need to be changed immediately. And then there's others such as fire breaks, which are important, but not so important as the main problem.
Okay, so shall we try and answer the question now?
I have answered on behalf of the Conservative Party there. Did you think so?
Oh, right. I think you might have to let them know.
Yeah, well, there you go.
So, the question is, do you think developers and the government are doing enough?
I think the developers, the developers that have built these blocks according to the building regs when they were built, have done absolutely nothing wrong. Some of the big ones that can afford to have said they'll go back and change the cladding or do the fire breaks, which is very generous of them, really, because when they were done correctly. As for the government, I've already said the government have already earmarked millions and millions of pounds for the combustible cladding to be changed in these blocks at no real cost to the residents. You could say, well, it's not the government's fault particularly. Well, so I have to say I'm coming out fighting here on behalf of the government slightly, because I think they're taking an awful lot of stick. Whatever happens in this country, if something goes wrong, it's the government's fault.
Well,
which is crazy.
I think the only thing I'd take issue with there, it's not the government that are paying for it; it's you and I who are paying.
Well,
taxes.
Of course, the government collect the revenue to run the country.
Oh, that is
so. We're all paying for it, and with all due respect, the three of us here are probably paying more than a lot of people. So. But what can the government do?
I wish, yeah.
What can the government do?
Well, Hayley, have you come across this?
I completely agree with John. They're never going to get it right. I think the support that they are giving is...
I have to say,
I can't
Hayley,
see them being able to do anything more than they are already doing. Like John said, everything was done correctly. There's two different scenarios here, but where regulations have changed, there's,
The one thing I would say is that they have been a little bit slow, perhaps, identifying all the blocks and actually issuing these grants. But government is a slow machine. If you want it done quick, don't ask the government.
There are two or three things happening here. You've got the main cladding issue, which,
yes.
which, as you say, the government seem to have got a grip on.
I think so.
But there are then peripheral issues,
Yes.
like your floor breaks, balcony claddings,
Yeah.
Decking, this
Yes.
this sort of thing. And I do just wonder if I don't wish to undermine the significance of the Grenfell lessons that we're all beginning to learn.
Yes.
But I do wonder if one or two of these things are a little bit jobs worth. You know, wonder if they're absolutely necessary.
Well, it's all or nothing, isn't it?
That's the problem.
And that's the problem.
I agree,
yeah.
Hayley. It's all
yeah.
or nothing. And
But
what I would say,
you see, I look round here, and you say, well, okay, well, let's take balconies for instance. Oh, you know, the wood might not be as flame resistant as it should be, perhaps. Yeah. Nor is it when people put washing out on their balconies.
Exactly. Yeah.
You know, we've all got a part to play here.
I agree entirely. I mean, the block we've done recently, the fire officer won't let us put paintings on the walls in the foyer.
No.
Or any furniture or anything in case of fire. Now that just seems to me a bit crackers.
Overkill.
You know, a bit overkill. And that's what happens. They go overkill. But you can sort of understand. They've got fire officers have got huge responsibilities.
Sure. Okay, well that seems like a tick for the government, doesn't it? Okay.
I think so on the whole.
They're doing okay on that one, yeah.
Right. Well, here's another government one, Hayley, just for you. With the government suggesting that no-fault evictions may become the norm with residential lets, do the panel think that this will have a negative effect on supply of rental properties as landlords become nervous about creating unbreakable tenancies?
Yeah, I mean, we've
So
spoken...
just a yes?
Yes, that's it, end of.
Next question.
Next question. No, I mean, we've spoken about this before, haven't we, you and I, Stephen, about the whole idea of an assured short hold tenancy is that it is a short hold and you can regain possession should you need to. So I absolutely think that it will have a negative impact on the number of people that are investing to become landlords. I even mentioned before about internationals, you know, it's a pro-landlord currently, arguably, as we said, over the last 12 months, perhaps not. But if you start putting, longer term tenancies, etc., it restricts our exits as investors. So
Totally.
when we invest, we want to make sure that we have multiple exit strategies and we watch the market, we adapt and change. That's how we're resilient. You know, everything doesn't just run smoothly. You have to adapt and change your business as the market changes, the area changes, the demand changes. If you're restricted in doing that, then it restricts your business. And I personally think that it will be a very bad decision to go down the route of...
I tell you what, I think the people that I worry for most are, if we take the buy-to-let market, I've often said that I think the problem with the buy-to-let market is there are certain people going into it believing that just by buying property you make money, which isn't necessarily the case.
No.
And people go into it with very little business acumen or knowledge, and that they can easily get into trouble. Now, my worry is that those people perhaps fund the buy-to-let property on a fairly highly geared mortgage. They then get in trouble. Perhaps they've lost their job and can't afford to either subsidise the voids or something like that. And then what effect's that going to have on the tenants if there isn't a cut-off point for the leases?
I can't believe you, Stephen.
Sorry?
Well, a property professional worrying about other people like you do. I can't believe it. Honestly, it's ridiculous.
It's only because we're on telly.
It's absolutely ridiculous, isn't it, Hayley? Yeah. I mean, what I would say is if you remember the time as I do when there was regulated tenancies.
Yeah.
You know, Mrs. Thatcher brought in the short hold tenancy.
Yeah.
Till then it was regulated, and before it was regulated, then it went to assured. So regulated was, you know, you couldn't get the tenants out ever, and we used to try and buy lots of blocks of flats with regulated tenants in, and we'd paid 50% of the vacant possession value because you couldn't get them empty. Yeah. We'd love that to happen again. We would. Then there was
what's your name, Ratman?
We would, wouldn't we? Because that's business. Then we had the assured tenancy, which was at market level, but you couldn't get them out, and that's what this government, I think, is going to end up doing again. Yeah. So market level, but you can't get them out. And one of their arguments is if there's a family and the children are at school, they don't want to have to keep moving them out to different schools and all the rest of it. They're very family orientated, the government, and I think that's why they're thinking of bringing it in. I think it's wrong because I think it stops people having the flexibility. You know, if you might want to rent your home for 3 years and then move in it yourself, they'll probably allow that actually, if you can prove you can move in it yourself. But
I think that's one of the reasons. One of the things you can
do.
I'm afraid.
But even so, if you've got a flat and you think, well, I'm going to rent it for 5 years, going to get it vacant and sell it, you may not be able to get it vacant, and that's wrong. If it's your own property,
similar to Scotland,
that's wrong.
isn't it?
Yeah.
Scotland have short assured tenancies, but their legal system is very different. And
but you see, again, with social housing, with council tenancies, for instance, I'm afraid I'm a bit more radical because I would say, you know, if somebody takes a council house, for instance, they've got it for life as long as they pay their rent.
I think that's wrong.
It is wrong. I mean, we had recently, one of the union bosses was heavily criticised for earning 100 and something thousand a year, and is living in a council house.
Yeah. That's not what they were built for.
It's not right. I almost think there ought to be perhaps you know, life seems to go in sort of 5-year cycles, doesn't it? You know, you've got your kids up to school, then up to sort of senior school, then up to university, those kind of cycles, and they may be the opportunities to reassess your tenancy.
I just think the whole thing is wrong, Hayley. I just think if you own a property vacant, if you buy it tenanted, it's slightly different, but if you buy it vacant and you want to rent it for 5 years and then have it vacant afterwards, why the hell shouldn't you be allowed to do that? It's bonkers.
You should be, and that's why it will affect you know, people coming into investors becoming landlords. They'll start investing in such as surfaced accommodation or development or flips. So we just have a lack of supply of rental properties to the market as a result.
And that's just what the government don't want.
Yeah.
The private landlord is so important to the government. It's hugely important.
And I'm not sure actually tenants do want to stay in the properties for longer. Yes, you've got families and, you know, in school catchment areas, etc. It's important. But as a landlord, I will actually, you know, issue a longer term tenancy.
You're hot, you are.
Yeah, no, but on their initial agreement with me, it is a standard AST at 6 months and that's it. But if they are a good tenant, I'm not going to move them out. They don't move out at the end of that term. It goes on to a rolling periodic. So.
Well, on that wonderfully cooperative note, we'll end this half of the show. So join us again after the break. Hello and welcome back to part 2 of Property Question Time. I'm Stephen Galpin and joining me are Hayley Andrews and John Howard. Welcome back.
Thank you.
John, your second question. Do the panel think that the housing market should be controlled, encouraged and supported on a much more local basis than is currently the position, with central government and the housing minister in particular dictating decisions? We seem to have had many housing ministers in very few years, and further, none of these ministers have ever really introduced any particular or memorable and effective policies.
Well, I don't think that's right.
How did I know you were going to say that?
Educated guess?
I appreciate the question, and I can understand where they're coming from. And absolutely right, 11 planning ministers, I think, in 12 years or 10 years, one or the other. I'm lost. Every time you go to the Conservative conference, there's a new one standing up who knows absolutely nothing about property, spouting off a load of rubbish. They're better off to have me up there than they would them. Much better. But or you, Stephen.
Have you mentioned
that?
Or
Hayley, by the way.
Have you mentioned that? Have you mentioned that?
I have mentioned it to Robert Jenerick, who was the housing secretary. Didn't go down very well. So, funnily enough,
I don't think he goes down terribly well, does he?
Well, interestingly, he's. But to say that they haven't brought out anything memorable is wrong, because look at office to residential permissive development. That has been massive. Whether it will be looked upon in the future as being successful or not, I think the jury is out. I think there's some very nice schemes, office to residential, and there's some pretty grotty ones, which are going to be, they say, nicknamed slums of the future. because they still look like offices, which is dreadful.
And no infrastructure.
And no infrastructure whatsoever. I agree with entirely. And I don't think developers in 2013, I think it was, could believe their luck. What? We don't need planning permission? No. Don't need supply parking? No. Don't need to have minimum size of rooms? No. Don't need, lighting, the lights, the natural light? No, that's relatively okay. And they've got 56 days to give you a certificate. Yeah. We couldn't believe our luck.
You must have thought it was your birthday.
I certainly did, and so did many, many other developers. The joke was, from our point of view, is that we've been doing, office to residential conversions for donkey's years. So it's just made life easier for us. But of course, by 2016, everyone else had jumped on the bandwagon, and now everybody's trying to do it. So, but the good thing the government have done in recent times is they've strengthened that and made it tougher. And up the standards of what you have to do. Minimum room sizes, 37 square metres, minimum light and so on. So they have improved things, and rightly so, because it was too loose. It was too loose. What was the question? Remind me.
Well, I think the essence of the question...
Have I answered it?
Well, yes, you have to a degree, but I think the essence of the question is, do we want more local control?
Well, of course... whether we want local control or not, as Hayley mentioned in the last programme, I think, Article 4, whether government want them or not, these local authorities are using Article 4, potentially not in the right way, to stop permissive development happening on a number of different types of properties and so on across the UK. So I think, I do think the government are going to have to square up to some of these councils, because I think they're using Article 4 in the wrong way and stopping housing development that could take place.
I think it just complicates everything. So while in some areas it requires Article 4 and that, that it needs to be looked at to keep it a balanced community and serve the community and the people that are living there. On the other hand, it actually complicates the whole process and restricts developers, good developers, actually moving forward.
Have you ever met one?
Yeah, I'm one. I'm sat next door to
another one.
Another one.
He knows we're only teasing. No, the thing that I do worry about is that I think, on balance, I would prefer more local control if that local control is qualified to make the decisions.
If you can trust it.
Yeah. Whether a dozen or so uninformed, property-wise uneducated councillors on a planning committee
scares me to death
are the right people.
I agree.
I'm not so sure.
With millions and millions of pounds in their fingertips, basically.
Yes.
Yeah, I think it needs to be, while it can't be one size fits all, there's a national standard and it should be the national standards. Local councils should follow the national standard guidelines.
But I think you hit on it in a way, though, that national standard has got to be simple and it's got to be understandable.
Well, if it's a standard, then, and it's throughout the whole of the UK or England, and Wales, then great. You can understand what that standard is and work towards it. The difficult thing now, and why people get into so much trouble, is they just assume that they can do this because, and that's not always the case. You've got Article 4, you've got different licensing requirements, all things like that.
And actually, you've got, we're doing a joint venture in Wales at the moment, and it's an office to residential, and there's no PD in Wales. You've got to go through the whole process, which is because that's because it's a Labour-run country, basically.
But it is a different country, isn't it?
Well, it's a different country, but still should be under UK. It's under UK control. Should be the UK government.
I think we might get one or two Welsh people right.
Well, I'm sure you will. I'm delighted to. We are delighted to discuss it with them.
Okay, well, that's very magnanimous.
That's okay, not a problem. As long as it's in English, not Welsh.
Right.
We won't understand it.
Okay, well, I think we'll leave that one there before we seal Welsh independence. Okay. Hayley, your favourite subject, HMOs.
Expert on them.
Interestingly enough, this is coming from the tenant's perspective, and it says, I'm considering renting a room in a building which has been converted into an HMO. Can I ask the experts if the landlord of such a property has any supplementary obligations to me, for example, services, as opposed to that of a normal single occupancy tenancy? I also wonder what extra obligations or what lesser rights might I have, if any?
Can I ask the tenant's name, just in case it's one of
one
mine?
of yours, yeah.
No, I'm only joking. So the tenancy agreement for a HMO is it is an AST, but it's a room-only AST. So where it is different is you have right of tenure over that room and permission to use the communal space along with the rest of the household. As a HMO landlord, I do offer all-inclusive rent. So we, all bills included. Gas, water, electricity, broadband, a cleaner and a gardener. But I would say check the AST because it depends on, there's no legal requirement for you to do that, although it is standard in the HMO arena, and many landlords will offer all-inclusive rent. It's not a legal requirement, you don't have to.
Is there a subtle difference between a room-only tenancy and, say, perhaps a tenancy agreement for a service department? Because it strikes me they're roughly on a par.
A service department is not a tenancy. So a service department is guest terms and conditions. So they have no right of tenure. Yeah. So just as you sign into a hotel, you sign their terms and conditions upon checking in. It's exactly the same. So if you stay for the amount of nights that you've paid, you have no right of tenure. If you don't pay, you don't stay, basically. Whereas with a HMO, you have a tenancy agreement. You have right of tenure over that room. It's a room-only tenancy agreement.
Okay.
But there are restrictions, though, in terms of how you occupy that property. You can't move your boyfriend or your girlfriend in, for example, because the landlord has to adhere to licensing requirements. There is a number of occupants that are allowed to live in that property. The facilities have to be, to meet the standards of the local licensing requirements. So yes, there are things, you can and can't do that are different to that if it was a standard AST on a flat, for example.
Yeah.
And you have...
I'm just trying to go behind the question a little bit, and I just think what was in their mind. And I think what strikes me is that if somebody signed a tenancy such as the one you describe, where you're providing a gardener, a kitchen facility perhaps, and cleaning, etc. So let's just say you do become a wicked landlord overnight, and you decide that you're not providing those services. Where do they go? Where do they go to complain?
Oh, I would have thought that they...
Would it be a normal Tier 1 tribunal? Or?
Yeah, I would have thought so. At the end of the day,
start with perhaps?
They will probably report you to the council, but it would be a tribunal because it's a contract dispute, basically. But it's unlikely to happen. So you would know when you're moving in what's included within your rent. If, for example, I stopped sending the garden around and I stopped cleaning, or sending a cleaner around, I don't do the cleaning myself.
Oh, I thought you might. No, right.
No. So if I stopped providing that service and that service was stipulated and broken down within the tenancy agreement, then I'm in breach, aren't I? So they would have an issue there, I'm sure.
And I think also these days, I mean, from donkey's years ago to now, I mean, these landlords like yourself and other people are very professional. It's not like it used to be. I mean, there are some rogue ones still, of course, but I mean, it's far more professional. You remember going back a few years, Stephen, you and I can remember, some pretty rogue landlords around 20, 30, 40 years ago. It's different now.
Yeah.
Sure.
It's more professional.
Yes. I mean, I think the sort of moral is here that it's the same with all leases. I mean, I've had to give advice on leases and from tenants and landlords' point of view over the years. And I keep saying this. I say, the landlord produces a lease which they're presumably happy with. You've looked at it as a tenant, presumably you're happy with it and signed it. So why don't you just both do what it says?
Yeah, absolutely.
That's the key. But I think on from that, I think the important thing to remember is that if you are a tenant, ask the questions. Don't let an agent push you into signing something because you've got to do it or else you'll lose it or whatever. There'll always be another property.
Yes, absolutely.
There'll always be somewhere else.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
do ask the questions, because once you have committed on your lease and your landlord's committed, that's what you're stuck with.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
No, good advice.
Just in terms of the additional stuff that a HMO landlord obviously has to do that you wouldn't have to if it was just a normal buy-to-let and a single family household. Of course, licensing requirements, the property has to be checked on a regular basis, whereas a more regular basis than a standard property that's let out to a family, for example. Fire safety has to be in place, everything, so there are additional requirements for a HMO landlord, but you won't get the licence if everything isn't in place and things like that. But that all should be displayed in the property.
And that's a very good thing, and that's what's changed over the last 40 years. Things are far more professional.
The quality of HMOs now are really, they're more like boutique, like you said, hotel rooms, aren't they?
And again, common sense says if you're looking to place, it's going to be your home, look round. If the garden's overrun, then it's not being looked after, is it? If the kitchen's messy, it's not being cleaned.
Absolutely.
It's not that hard. No. Okay, well, look, I'm going to thank you both very much for coming in.
Pleasure.
Hayley Andrews, thank you very much. John Howard, thank you.
Me.
Really great to see you again. My name's Stephen Galpin. Join me again next time on Property Question Time.